So as I mentioned, we are in chapter 16. So first of all, just like congratulations on, we're like over halfway there. Or I suppose, would it be, I don't know if it's last week. There's 31 chapters, we're in 16, so we'll call today kind of the midpoint where there were 15 before, there's 15 after. Today's the midpoint. So first of all, I guess a feather in your, we'll give you bonus points, and the points are worthless, but you can have as many bonus points for making it this far. It's like on bad weather days, people show up for church and say, "Well, do I get bonus points for being here?" Absolutely, as many as you want. They're worthless, but you can have as many bonus points as you would like. We'll just keep doling them out. So. It's also a word of encouragement to keep hanging in there, because at the beginning there's kind of that excitement. It's both something new, and then also there tended to be some more familiar stories at the beginning. Those are the ones that perhaps we learned at a very young age and carried with us, or just the ones that have caught the attention within the culture. So it's kind of hard not to at least know that Noah's Ark is a thing, for instance. As we get to a week like today, we're in some ways feels like we're getting to the dregs of the Old Testament, because who's sitting around talking about King Hezekiah? That's not exactly a story that's particularly captured our attention in the same way. So just keep hanging in there. And maybe at this midpoint, it's a time also for us to highlight. I just want to take a moment to circle back to talk just for a couple minutes about the Bible itself. So it both applies to certainly what we're doing today, but then even through the entire scope of the story and beyond as well. Just so I think we can be clear about what the Bible is not, but also be clear about what the Bible is. So one of the things I would offer that the Bible is not is, are we going here, Fred? Is that's the Bible. So that's what the Bible is. Also, I picked this picture in particular because there's like highlighting in it. And so some people feel like somehow the paper and the ink on the paper is sacrosanct and is supposed to be like not, I mean, put your Bible to use. So if you're a note taker, by all means, take notes, highlight, write questions, whatever it might be. Put that all to use. So the Bible is not an instruction manual. So this is an owner's manual for a pickup truck. How many of you have owner's manuals in your vehicles? Yeah, we all have owner's manuals. How many of you read your owner's manual on a regular basis? No, when do you typically utilize your owner's manual? Yeah, when you got a problem, right? That's what it's there for. So you need to know how, where the washer fluid goes, or usually it's where in the heck is the trunk latch anyway? And how do I'm not able to ever open the hood of a vehicle. So we typically don't. They're long, they're arcane. They're helpful, they're useful, of course. But let's be clear, that's not what the Bible is. It's not an owner's manual, because if we think about what an owner's manual is, it's something we only use, in times when there's a problem or something else, and then that doesn't really that doesn't get us to an experience. There's nothing really meaningful about an owner's manual in any ways. Have you also noticed how long these things are too? Like this one's 420 pages. Who writes these things, Bonnie?
You're lucky if you even get one.
Yeah, you're lucky. I mean, yeah, this is the PDF. So I mean, if I wanted, I could print it out. Also, the Bible's not an answer key. I always think about, it was, for whatever reason, it's my calculus book in high school. I just remember the answer key in the back, or, it's true, math books tend to have the answer keys in the back, and it's the honor system. You don't look in the back till after you try and everything else. But that's not what the Bible is. Sometimes people go and say, well, I have this question, so I'm going to go to the Bible, and then it's the answer key. So it will give me the answer to the question I'm bringing to it. But that's not how the Bible works. So yes, we have some questions the Bible may answer. We also have lots of questions, as I've said before, that the Bible has no interest in answering whatsoever, which doesn't mean they're not good questions and legitimate questions. It simply means that they're not questions that the Bible is going to engage directly. Indirectly, probably. But that's where we have to then start seeing where the nuance is and what it means to have a text that we read, and then here's the key word, interpret. Because every time we read the Bible, we're interpreting the Bible. There's no way to have some sort of plain, flat reading, because if you've ever seen what the existing texts look like from the original documents, and it's not even like the original documents, it's the copies of the copies of the copies, and we trust it's inspired and God's at work, but it's also, I mean, we're not reading it in Hebrew and Greek and the little bit of Aramaic that's in there either, so we're filtering through lots of things, and we trust there's something there, but again, answer key isn't the guide, isn't what the Bible is. And one other piece I want to highlight of what the Bible is not, and part of this is just so I can brag on my kid too, but the Bible is not a puzzle to solve. So this is my son Ian, or at least his hands, and what's he holding? A Rubik's Cube. Anyone, we're all familiar with Rubik's Cube. Who can solve a Rubik's Cube? Maybe your grandson, yeah. Well, and so we can see. So it's all messed up here, and then so it's a puzzle to solve, and so what Ian has done, much like your grandson, my mom's grandson, I guess, is in the same boat. So you can just watch, and then you'll see that he's got this puzzle. He knows what to do. He's learned there are actually algorithms that you learn to know how to process through, so that however mixed up the cube is, if you go through the algorithms, you'll keep getting through, and then by the end, you will solve it. Yeah, I'll tell him. It was like 45 seconds. That's he's actually got one of those timer pads too, so I don't know what his personal best was, but he was happy to put on a show for you. So, but the thing is, when you've got the puzzle and you've got it solved, then what do you do with it? He'd mess it back up and do it, but otherwise, you put it away. And if you think that the Bible is a puzzle to solve, like if there's just these things, and if we figure it out, and then when it's figured out, its utility is gone. And so I want to just be clear that the Bible is also not a puzzle to solve. So what I want to highlight, and again, it's something I've said before, but I think it bears repeating, that what the Bible is a conversation partner. I don't know who in this conversation is the Bible or not, but it's the idea that there's this back and forth, because we know that we bring something to the text absolutely brings something to us, and there is this dynamic that goes back and forth, that if this is a living word of God that is inspired, so that's something then that changes us, and then we bring something to it as well, and there's some sort of engagement back and forth, and it's not even just a one-on-one, but even in a group. And I like this picture just because of the different facial expressions. Because there are times, like the guy with the glasses, I mean, a lot of times that's probably how we feel when we're reading some of the stuff. And we're like, what? What is this? What's going? So it's okay to say because we know that when we are in conversation with others, sometimes it's really great. It's generative. It's uplifting. Other times it's difficult. It's hard. We have to have hard conversations. Sometimes it's just flat out confusing. We don't even know what's going on or what we're talking about or whatever else, but there's something that happens. And then also, one of the things, and that's something that everyone, at least in this room, is committed to, is there's something about having the Bible as a conversation partner among a group of people as well, because then we get to new places in the midst of what we're experiencing. Because if we hold that the Bible is again, inspired, that it is somehow the living Word of God, and we know that it speaks to different realities, because we've been placing it into its historical context. So we'll talk a little bit about what was going on in the 8th century BCE today. We also know that it was probably transcribed later than that, So there was a reality into which it spoke that was kind of why it was collected. And then later on, it gets canonized, so put into the biblical canon, into what we would call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. And then eventually we know there's a New Testament. And then we also know that it says something to us today. And so that's a living word, but it's also, it's a complex word. I trust that if you've been along this journey and you're on week 16, you know how complex this is. And one of the things that we'll really highlight today, especially as we get into the prophet Isaiah, is that the Bible contains a surplus of meaning. A surplus of meaning. We'll unpack that a little bit later on. But that's part of just the wealth of what the Bible contains. So it's important for us not to be reductive in just thinking that it's an answer key, an owner's manual, or a puzzle or a problem to solve. That it's a richer, deeper experience than that. So we get today to the beginning of the end, not of the story, but of the kingdom of Israel. And interestingly, and this is a chapter 2, that some of the chapters are like really well titled. This one, it's like the kingdom of Israel is done about 2 pages into the chapter. So really it's gone right by the beginning. So we'll start though with the fall of Israel. And so if you're in the story, it's just the very first couple pages, 219 and 220. What I'll do is I'll read it out of the NRSV and I think include some of the verses that aren't necessarily in the story, but just to get us centered with where we are and what's going on. So we're here around the year 721 BCE, and BCE in the last generation has replaced BC in talking about the eras. So CE is the common era, what has also been called AD, which, Anno Domini, so if you want to be Latin, you can do that. But it's just kind of a more, a better descriptor in English, at least, of what those eras are about. So 721, and what we read then in 2 Kings 17, I'll just read these verses. In the 12th year of King Ahaz of Judah. So if we remember that the writers of say 1st and 2nd Kings are always twinning the kings of the north and of the south. So that's where the chronologies, there's always this pairing of whatever is going on in the north. The marker is, well, who was the king in the south, and vice versa. King Ahaz, as we'll hear in a little bit, is the father of King Hezekiah. But we're not talking about Hezekiah yet, because we have Hoshea, a son of Elah, began to reign in Samaria over Israel. He reigned 9 years, and as we are unsurprised by now to hear, for a king of Israel, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not like the kings of Israel who were before him. King Shalmaneser of Assyria, so that's important to note, Assyria, that's the big world power of their day, came up against him. Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. So he said, well, nope, you can, we'll let you rule over us, just treat us okay. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to King So of Egypt and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria confined him and imprisoned him. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria. For 3 years he besieged it. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He carried the Israelites away to Assyria. He placed them in Hala on the Habor, the river of the Gozan, in the cities of the Medes. So I just propose we have this as the reading, and someone who's not me reads it out loud. So this occurred, now of course, because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So of course there's both the callback to the story of the Exodus. There's this repetitive callback throughout all these stories. Just remember, who is this God you're turning away from? Oh, the one who freed you from from slavery in Egypt. And then, of course, there's the irony that Hoshea was making treaties with the king of Egypt to try to protect his hide. So they had worshipped other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had introduced. So they were just trying to fit in with the cool kids around them. Verse 9, the people of Israel secretly did things that were not right against the Lord, their God. They built for themselves high places at all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars and sacred poles on every high hill and under every green tree. There they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did, whom the Lord had carried away before them. They did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. They served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, you shall not do this. That's the whole you shall have no other gods before me thing. Then verse 13, yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your ancestors and that I sent to you by my servants and prophets. They would not listen, but were stubborn, as their ancestors had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. So there's a lot to unpack. There's plenty there to unpack and deal with, but the piece that I want to talk about, especially because we're getting into the time of the prophets. Oftentimes, prophets get misunderstood or I've heard them misidentified as those who tell the future in advance, which is, I would say, a very poor definition of a prophet, and we'll unpack a definition of a prophet a little bit later on, because in verse 13, there would be no warning. God wouldn't be warning the people if the prophets had come and just said, here's the future and exactly how it will play out. Prophets' messages were always if, then. There are always words of promise and words of warning. If, then. So there's a contingency there. And so we'll get to that, but I think it's just very important to make sure that we're clear about what a prophet, just like what the Bible is and what the Bible is not, what a prophet is and what a prophet is not. So if a prophet were telling history in advance, there wouldn't be any warning. It would just be like, well, kind of stinks to be you because here's what's coming. People have agency, and that's part of our relationship with God. We have agency. We have a say. So here's a map. So after the book of Revelation in your Bible, you may find the book of maps. That's a joke. You may find maps nonetheless. But this is the Assyrian Empire around that time in the 8th century. That line is, one of a guess at where the exiles went from Israel into Assyrian captivity. And it's just worth noting here. So the Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BCE was the main world power, but there were other competing world powers in that area as well. So from where you see where it says Samaria, so that's noting Israel, and then Jerusalem and Judah to the south of it. But from Samaria there, Assyria is to the northeast. So that darker orange that's on the map, that's the kingdom of Assyria. But then a rising world power was Babylon to the southeast, and we'll be getting more into Babylon and what their relationship, for lack of a better word, to Judah is in the coming weeks. But then there's also Egypt to the southwest, and Egypt was always an important place, partly because of the Nile River. So Egypt was known as the breadbasket of the Nile because then in that area, people did not have to depend on the rains in order for produce to grow because the Nile allowed for all of the moisture and whatever, so that it was a very fertile place because of the richness of having that water source always there. So droughts were not a problem typically in Egypt. So that also means, politically speaking, that the kingdoms from these other areas who were subject to drought, it was kind of advantageous if they were in control of Egypt. And so if we note where where Israel is, it's kind of on this land bridge between rivers, and so Assyria would want to trample over Israel back and forth to try to control Egypt. So those are just some of those political realities in that day and age as well. The story we hear, though, is that the people were turning away from God. King Hoshea of Israel in the north had made these treaties, and rather than relying on the leadership of God, was relying on these relationships and the leaders of Assyria and Egypt. The Assyrian king didn't like that they were making treaties with Egypt as well, and said, to heck with it. We're just going to overrun you, because Israel didn't stand a chance if Assyria wanted to assert themselves like that. And so they were taken into exile. And so that's the beginning of the end, I guess, of the kingdom of Israel. So then we pivot pretty quickly to King Hezekiah of Judah. And so that's in the south. Just a reminder, Israel's in the north, Judah's in the south. It's alphabetical IJ, Israel and Judah. And so we have King Hezekiah, who is the king of Judah, kind of around this time. So he's following his father, again, King Ahaz. And we hear about Hezekiah in 2 Kings 18. So it's on page 220 of the story. And I'm going to read verses 1 through 7. And not all of these verses are included in the story, but I'll be reading again from the NRSV. 2 Kings 18, verses 1 through 7. So in the 3rd year of King Hoshea, son of Elah of Israel, Hezekiah, son of King Ahaz of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord, just as his ancestor David had done. So his dad was a bad king. Hezekiah is a good king. So verse 4, he removed the high places, broke down the pillars, and cut down the sacred pole. So those are all the things that his dad instituted, and he brought a policy change. And then unfortunately, the story cuts out this next half of verse 4. So this is stunning to think about. He broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the people of Israel had made offerings to it. It was called Nehushtan. He trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that there was no one like him among all the kings of Judah after him, or among those who were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept the commandments that the Lord had commanded Moses. The Lord was with him wherever he went. He prospered. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. So we have an explanation of a bit of who Hezekiah was, and then why he was regarded as a good king. So he was removing all of those idols and those worship sites. And interestingly, is again that verse 4b from 2 Kings 18. So just a reminder, here's what it says in Numbers 21, verse 9. And maybe you remember this from several months ago. So this is when all the snakes were there inviting the people, and then God said, well, here's what you do. So Moses made a serpent of bronze and put it upon a pole, and whenever a serpent bit someone, that person would look at the serpent of bronze and live. All right, so that's what we had as this sign of life, the bronze serpent on the pole. But then what we read in 2 Kings 18, 4b, Hezekiah broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. Which seems weird. It was this thing that was bringing healing to all the people. Apparently it was so important that it had all these centuries later traveled along and was still in existence. But here's what happened. For until those days, the people of Israel had made offerings to it. It was called Nehushtan. And so that's the sneaky part about a false idol, is that a lot of false idols are in their essence something good, but then when they get put in the place of God, we see how God responds to that thing. So that pole healed the people. That was the sign in Numbers 21, and it still gets used today in the American Medical Association on their seal. So that's an important, that's a compelling image. But what happened is the people started worshiping the image, this thing, rather than worshiping God, the one who healed them. They were worshiping the sign of the healing versus the one who healed them. So that's, one of those things that could be worth that the conversation partner piece. And as we have our conversation partners today, one of the things for us to consider, what are those things in our lives that are good, but that we have a tendency to put in the place of God? And then perhaps the harrowing part is, what's God's response? What might God's response be? So something maybe worth discussing a little bit in your groups. So what are the implications of that? So just a very brief note. I'm not going to dig into this today, but you'll notice it's in 2 Kings 19:35. It's about Hezekiah and is a king Sennacherib and all these people. The army winds up all dead. I'm not going to re-litigate the issue of divine violence today. I've talked about it plenty. I'm sure it'll come up again. I would just offer that if you say, nope, God killed them all, well, then I would offer that your task is going to be twofold. Then how is this God trustworthy? How do we know we're not the army people? And then how is this God made known in Christ? So that's, I would say, the task you have. So you can hold that interpretation, but those are the questions I would offer. On the other hand, too, if you say, well, God didn't kill them, but it says this because, and so maybe it was because there was a plague or some other illness that killed them, and people, kind of looking back said, well, no, God did this. Kind of that insurance thing, like it's an act of God. We all have that in our insurance policies. But we know that when Hurricane Katrina comes, I don't take anyone seriously who says God wanted Hurricane Katrina to wipe out, New Orleans in the way it did. But if you say that, then the task is to offer, how do we coherently interpret the Bible? And there's other implications as well. So I just want to offer, again, that's the conversation partner piece. And it's not a puzzle to solve either. So we're not going to land and say, this is exactly right and I can prove it. But to say it can be generative conversation, because then we have to, again, do that piece of interpretation as we encounter the messages in Scripture. So all that's going on. Hezekiah, good king, and he then encounters the prophet Isaiah. But before we get to Isaiah, just want to take a moment to define a prophet. And so this is my own definition, so I wasn't looking stuff up, but if someone just put me on the spot and said, how would you define a prophet, and specifically a biblical prophet? These would kind of be the 3 points that I would raise up. That they're messengers from God who bring words of promise and warning. Like I said before, it's if, then. Also a biblical prophet, they were wildly unpopular, immensely disliked, and they were almost always unsuccessful. The only completely successful Old Testament prophet was Jonah, and Jonah was miserable because he was successful because he hated the Ninevites, which means that no one wants to be a prophet. No one wants to be a prophet. They are never self-appointed. Never trust someone who says that they're a prophet because they think they are. And if someone is popular and considered a prophet, be highly skeptical. Be highly skeptical, because prophets are not popular. So just to bring this into life, and I know that the group talked a little bit about prophets last week, and I think especially with Monday being MLK Day, he's probably a good contemporary example of this for us, because he was wildly unpopular when he was alive. In 1966, it was the last time Gallup took a poll about the favorability rating of Martin Luther King Jr. His unfavorable rating was 63% across America. In 1968, so the year that he was killed, MLK had a public disapproval rating of nearly 75%, according to a Harris poll. 75% of Americans disapproved of MLK in the year he was assassinated. However, in 2019, an Ipsos poll found that he had a 90% approval rating from Americans, which is very interesting. Very interesting. And so he did speak some hard words of truth, but what's also interesting is to pay attention on days like MLK Day, what gets highlighted and what gets ignored. So I just want to offer perhaps an illustration of how beyond the scope of a prophet's life, their message can either be watered down or removed from its context. So one of King's most famous correspondences was his letter from a Birmingham jail, which he wrote on April 16th, 1963. And so one of those quotes that we highlight, and you probably heard the middle part of this little paragraph at some point in the last week or so as his memory was honored. He wrote this: "I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." That's the line we like. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. All right, we kind of like that one. However, here's the hard edge, and why I can see why he had a 75% disapproval rating. Because later on in that letter, he wrote this, and these are his words: "I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed by the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection." That's not the one we quote. So we understand why he was unpopular, because those words make us uncomfortable. And so biblical prophets' words made the people uncomfortable, because they said things that they didn't want to hear. That's why they were wildly unpopular and very rarely successful, because they were trying to change some seemingly intractable realities. But the reality is still they were trying to change it, and there was never a loss of hope, because God was always there trying to work for the good that God wanted for the people. But God was seeking partnership with the people in order to bring about that good, and only very rarely was it welcomed. Only very rarely was it embraced. So Isaiah is the prophet we highlight this week. So his background and setting, again, he started in 8th century BC. Just some words about him, in case you're interested. This is from an Old Testament scholar, Robert Wilson, who wrote this: "There is some support for the traditional scholarly view that Isaiah was an upper-class Jerusalemite who grew up in the city." So probably he was from Jerusalem and probably lived in a family of means. The prophet seems to have known and had access to members of the royal court, and he apparently had no difficulty gaining an unofficial audience with the king. So in order to have an audience with the king, so King Hezekiah and Isaiah are recorded as being in conversation. So you have to have a certain status in the culture. Now, what's interesting is Isaiah used his status in order to do God's work rather than using God's status to enrich himself. Because then what Isaiah brought to the king and to the people wasn't going to make Isaiah much more preferred. So then Walter Brueggemann and Todd Linnefelt write this about Isaiah and his location. Isaiah's work in the midst of the royal establishment in both harsh judgment and buoyant promise was to insist that the public life of Jerusalem could not be properly understood or practiced except by reference to Yahweh, who is the ultimate sovereign of public history, the pretenses of Assyrian imperialists notwithstanding. So again, Isaiah's message was to encourage Hezekiah to keep calling the people back to God. So that's what was going on. The construction of the book of Isaiah, just very briefly to talk about, most scholars believe that there are kind of three parts of Isaiah then that are put together into what we have as the book of Isaiah. So what would be considered first Isaiah is chapters 1 through 39. And this setting is before the exile. So before the Babylonian exile. So it feels like we're getting ahead of ourselves. We are just a little bit, but that's because Isaiah spans so much. The book of Isaiah, which includes both kind of the original prophet Isaiah and then those who are clearly in Isaiah's trajectory later on. So we have first Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 before the exile. And that's the 587 exile that comes later. There's second Isaiah, which is chapters 40 through 55, which scholars believe the setting that makes sense is to see them as written and communicated during the exile. So during the Babylonian exile of the south. And then third Isaiah, chapters 56 through 66, is post-exile. So as the people are returning and seeing that what they hoped for when they returned looked different than what they were seeing as they returned. And so Isaiah can really be a guide through the rest of our journey through the Old Testament. So first Isaiah 1 through 39 before the exile, 40 through 55 during the exile, 56 through 66 after the exile. And so one of the other things about Isaiah is that there's this surplus of meaning that it comes. That's what I mentioned earlier. And the surplus of meaning is that it meant one thing in its original context. And we want to be very clear to uphold that and to say that that's important, that this was saying something important in its original setting. Because there are some parts of Isaiah that because of the surplus of meaning, and then they connect so well, or they were used by the early church to make sense of Jesus, to help understand Jesus, so that's legitimate as well, but we don't want to ignore its original setting as well. The text can do both. The text can do both. So one of the instances is the call of Isaiah, which maybe you've heard, and if not, I'll just read Isaiah 6, verses 1 through 8. It's pages 224 and 225 of the story. And it reads like this. In the year that King Uzziah died, so that's around 733 BCE, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne. So this is Isaiah's vision. I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. So that's an important enough phrase that we sing that time and again and again and again. Holy, holy, holy. Verse 4, the pivots on the thresholds shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. Now remember, smoke and fire in the Old Testament are symbols of God's presence. And I said, woe is me. I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And we remember that casting your gaze upon God, the assumption was you were a goner, because you could not behold that. Verse 6, then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, first of all, ouch. Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send and who will go for us? And I said, here am I, send me. So there we have, in its original context, we can hear how Isaiah experienced his own call, and hopefully we can see how God can work in our lives to call us to things that we think we are completely unequipped to do. Like, woe is me, are you serious, God? And what God says is, I will equip you to do whatever I call you to do. And so that's the surplus of meaning. So it means something very deep and profound in its original setting in Isaiah's day, and it means something deep and profound for us in our day as well. It also shows us that Isaiah suffered from imposter syndrome, which is there's a tendency in many of us to think that if I have to be in a group or I'll be exposed as an imposter, that I don't know what I'm doing, or I'll be seen as not legitimate. That's actually the biggest hurdle to people joining a Bible study, is people don't join because they assume everyone else in the group already knows it and they're going to be exposed as the imposter who doesn't, and all of us know that's not true. So Isaiah is a very identifiable character for us. Then the other piece, and I'll just hit on this very briefly, but the servant songs in Isaiah, and the servant song from Isaiah 52 and 53 will be part of the reading and worship this weekend. Now those, that surplus of meaning, it's really important for us to see it in its fullness. So in its original setting, so these servant songs, these series of servant songs, and you can read those pages 228 to 230 in the story. Israel is the servant. So the United Kingdom of Israel is seen as the servant, the one who is doing these things and even suffering as a result for them. Later on, centuries later, this Jesus comes. He's teaching stuff. He's healing people. He winds up quoting Isaiah a whole lot. And then as people are trying to make sense of who Jesus was, they would read back into a book like Isaiah to say, oh, this might help us make some sense. Not that the original intention of those texts was to say Jesus is coming, but to make sense of who this Jesus is, to say that this Jesus is in line with all of these things. And here are attributes or how we can help make sense, because Jesus was not the sort of Messiah anyone expected. There was no model of kingship that Jesus, he didn't fit the mold, as it were. And so it was a way to use those texts to read back in order to hear something new about Jesus. But it's also important to uphold and respect their original intent as well back in Isaiah's day. So we can do both. And that's, again, the surplus of meaning that the Bible holds. It's kind of like in music, when songs get sampled and put into other songs, like Herbie Hancock. The jazz great Herbie Hancock, a lot of his music has been repurposed and reused into hip hop because of the feel of it, and then it deepens that. So it's still that original melody that Herbie Hancock created back in the day, but then it gets repurposed and changed and into something new, to expand into something different as well. So just something to think about. So the last couple things, the book of Isaiah, it's the most quoted prophetic book in the New Testament. So Isaiah is always getting quoted by New Testament writers. Isaiah is also always getting quoted by Jesus. Jesus' first public teaching, he quotes from Isaiah chapter 61, and it's worth noting, Jesus interprets Isaiah 61 because he actually reinterprets Isaiah 61. So that's part of our model as well. We can look to see how Jesus engaged these prophetic texts and the Old Testament to be a guide for us as we continue our journey through the Old Testament too. So that's what I got today. Thanks so much. Blessings on your conversation, and enjoy the beginning of the end, I guess.